Anyway, welcome everybody. Thank you as always. Welcome to Irish Influence. We are going fortnightly through June, July and August. The basic idea we're running along is the notion of almost like an Irish summer school to keep us entertained during the summer months. Thanks as always though to the Irish Consulate in Boston and in Irish Studies in Boston College. But for tonight's guest, Joe, it's over to you.
Thanks very much, Mike, and apologies yet again for my absolute incompetence here. I really don't know what I do wrong. I do it very, very wrong, and I've done it very, very wrong again. Thank you, Mike. Thanks very much for our guest tonight, who's Barry McCrea. Lovely to see you, Barry. And Barry is a writer and academic. He grew up in Dalkey, here in County Dublin, and was educated by Jesuits, no less, at Gonzaga College, and then in Trinity College Dublin here. He teaches and researches in the departments of English, Romance, Language and Literatures, and Irish Language and Literature at the University of Notre Dame. Barry McCrea is one of the most significant voices to emerge from Irish studies in North America. He's the author of 2 monographs, Languages of the Night, published by Yale University Press, 2015, which won the American Comparative Literature Association's René Wellek Prize for the Best Book of 2016, and In the Company of Strangers, Narrative and Family in Dickens, Conan Doyle, Joyce and Proust, published by Columbia in 2011, as well as a novel, The First Verse, which was winner of the Ferro-Grumley Prize for Fiction and the Barnes and Noble Discover Award. So there's quite an amount of stuff to go round there, Barry, and plenty for us to talk about. And just to remind people, please, if you've got questions, put them to us and we'll put them to Barry in turn. And first of all, Barry, can I just say that welcome here for a start? I guess that's the first thing. And secondly, you appeared here on the blurb as academic and author. Should it be author and academic? In what role do you feel most comfortable, I guess? Which of those roles gives you most pleasure?
I think I like them both, and they offer distinct but related pleasures. And you're right that it is about pleasure, I think. I really believe in, and the older I get, the more I believe in it, rather than the other way around. I really believe in the world of literature. I think it is a semi-autonomous world of its own that's worth dwelling in, and certainly it's the way that I make sense of the world is through it. I always wanted to be a novelist. That was all from the very youngest age. It's something I'm not able not to do, and you know, if I'm not doing it, I'm unhappy if I'm not writing fiction. But then the other part of it, which is the day job, I get immense satisfaction from, in all parts of it, in fact, teaching and also thinking about writing. You know, and I think there is, there's sometimes a sort of a snotty tendency amongst writers to dismiss academics and say, oh, well, it's the academics destroyed Joyce, or all the academics. Whereas, in fact, I think the literary system relies on literary studies and academia in very fundamental and organic ways. And to me, there is something very noble about the pursuit of interpretation, to read what other people have said, have written rather, and to think about it carefully. It's a form of listening rather than talking. So it's something that I place great value on. I think it's something that I really would, it kind of gets my back up when I hear people dismiss it. It's sort of a kind of a throwaway comment, people say, critics.
Sure.
But I think that it's a fundamental, and for example, Joyce, any of these people, Joyce, Elizabeth Bowen, any of the people we hate and think are important, it's just a fact they wouldn't be in our literary ecology in the same way if it wasn't for these goddamn professors and grad students pouring over them. That's the reason we know about them at all, really.
Absolutely.
Sorry, there's a more polemical answer than you
That's all right. That's okay. That's lovely, actually. So no contradiction between those two roles. On the contrary, if I'm hearing you properly, pleasure being at the center of both of them. So the pleasures of literature and the pleasure of teaching and the pleasure of teaching people to gain pleasure out of literature.
Exactly.
That's I think what gives us, and interpretation is a big part of that pleasure. So thanks.
And it's so you can give somebody that they'll have forever, you know. I mean, it's like, you know, a puppy's not for Christmas, it's for life. If you really teach somebody to read in a way that gives them pleasure, they can carry it with them forever. and it'll never wear out. No, it is really giving them something that they'll have forever.
If it was a polemic to begin with, Barry, it was a well worthwhile one, and nobody's going to object on this side of the counter to it. That's really, really excellent. Now, can I go back just a little bit to some earlier days, if I may? Growing up in the 70s and 80s, I think I'm right there indeed, in what might have been surely a rather different Ireland. Can I ask you just a little, if you wish, about your early days in those leafy suburbs that are Dalkey?
So yeah, I was born in the mid 70s, and so I suppose my formative years of the 80s and 90s. Yeah, everybody says that when you say Dalkey, everybody says, "Oh, Dalkey." You know, the truth, as always with small places, is that it's more complicated and more interesting than that. So at least it was. I mean, people now use the word as though it was Malibu or something. You know, Beverly Hills. That's
Magaluf.
And what's that?
Magaluf. I'm sorry, I was just going a step further than Malibu.
But there were, I feel, when I was growing up, there were basically 3 Dalkeys. There's that one, the kind of these beautiful big houses on the sea where there's, you know, racing car drivers and washed up pop stars and rich lawyers and things. Was the kind of what people used to call Old Dalkey, which is a sort of very tight working class community right in the center of the town. Hugh Leonard is a product of that, for example. That's a solid old working class community that were kind of in charge in a funny way, I felt. And then there's the kind of the last bit, which is these housing estates that I built in the 1950s and 60s of what were essentially culture transplants, so migrants from rural Ireland, guards, nurses, civil servants, and that's the Dalkey that I grew up in. There's almost nobody from Dublin there. It was all transplants from other places.
Okay, thanks. That location.
It was a very intimate place. You know, you saw everybody at mass. I mean, there's actually it's a fairly Protestant place too, so we didn't see them at mass, but the church is also close by. So but maybe on Sundays you saw everybody. One way or another, there was something of growing up in a country town about it. In some ways, more than a glitzy suburb.
Thanks for locating yourself actually there, kind of socially and culturally to a degree. And you spoke about mass. Well, you did perhaps attend mass because for your secondary school you attended Gonzaga College here in Dublin, and I mention that particularly because it is run by the Jesuits, the same organisation with which myself and Mike are associated in a peripheral, at least, fashion indeed. Can you say anything about that and about that Catholic experience in those formative years of adolescence and how that plays into the world afterwards, perhaps you've inhabited?
I mean, the question, did you go to mass, as you know, was not a question that was really posed at the time. I mean, nobody asked me if I was going to go or not, but I went. I feel, you know, I've recently been rewatching the films of Almodovar, I think my favorite filmmaker, and he is so saturated in the Catholic world, and I feel I am also. It's utterly and completely part of not just who I am, but how I arrange reality in the world. And I suppose the Jesuits added an intellectual level to that more sort of visceral pagan Catholicism I had in boyhood. But for me, Gonzaga was more. Well, again, you know, there's a beautiful essay by Seamus Dean's friendship with Seamus Heaney, and you know, they were in St. Colum's in Derry together. And Dean, instead of talking about all the many things they had in common, you know, being from County Derry, going to St. Colum's and all that, he talks about how they're different. They were in slightly different social groups in the school. That for Dean seemed like a fundamental division in the universe. Day boys who were from the city, like Dean, and boarders like he knew from the countryside, and that involved a whole set of different things, you know, football versus Gaelic football versus soccer, and all these, but also attitudes. And I felt when I went to Gonzaga, which is a micro social class ahead of the one I grew up in, I was astounded. I felt like I'd been sent to Versailles or something, you know, from some rustic mountaintop. These boys whose fathers were judges, who, you know, whose great grandmothers had been in commandement or had fought in the First World War and had lived in Dublin for generations in these lovely red brick houses, I was completely agog from it. I just thought it felt like emigrating. So I feel it was my first emigration. So that's really, for me, it gave me a sense. Also, these people who had a relationship to the state that I found very different. I mean, they were very senior civil servants and judges and things. And I suppose they were running the state but they had a sense of ownership on the Irish state, a sense that they created it. And it was very different from the world I grew up in, where the state was, a provider of at a distance. So I think I was kind of entranced by that.
Fabulous. Oh, that's fascinating.
Within that, Barry, were you given those elite schools, the way they kind of operate, their connections, as you say, with the law, with the judiciary, with major finance, and then particularly with the state in various forms, those schools, the 3 or 4 of them around Dublin, do replicate themselves. That, so many boys who go to those schools, they're going there because their father, grandfather, and on we go went there, and that's where they were formed. And those boys walk with a swagger which knows they're going to inherit, whatever it is, the law, finance, and so on. Did you feel an outsider or an insider then within that, or did you become an insider? I mean, how do you, if you're saying this is new to you, or this is a vision of the world you've not seen before, given you there for 6-7 years, when you leave at 18, are you with them? Do you understand them? Are they still different?
That's a great question, Mike. And I've often thought about it and talked to my best friend, still my friend from school, and it's something we've chatted about. I think both. There definitely was a difference between the boys who hadn't been to what they called the prep school, so who had come from ordinary national schools. That was half of us, and then the ones who had been there all along. So there was a difference between the kind of real Dublin 6 and then, and it's very Dublin 6 more than Dublin 4. It's just these little microcosms of their own reality. On the other hand, it couldn't but rub off on you, because you're surrounded by it all the time. And I do think that gay people, at least in my generation and before, have obviously a complicated relationship to male swagger. So to what extent, no one's, I'm not going to say, no one wants to describe themselves as a swaggerer, but I don't think I am. And I don't know to what extent that's because that's from his a more ordinary social background, or because of the gay thing. But certainly they were always visible to me, though, as a distinct tribe, and not a wholly negative one by any means. I mean, like all tribes, they have their ups, their good sides and their downsides. But that world, I didn't know it existed before I went, and now I feel it is very visible to me as something that exists. Yeah, I don't feel in it though fully either.
And one thing again, I mean, I always found, I kind of went, it's a very different context in England, but when I watched Bennett's The History Boys, there was a moment where I just thought, I went to that school, I had those teachers. And it's that thing of, there is a degree of privilege to it. We're preparing you, this small group, to be the best, whatever that means. But also, I think the one thing that I think now has changed, that eccentricity of teachers. Teachers who were quoting great reams of poetry, or when they told you about their history, they were living every minute of it. What kind of teachers did you have within that Jesuit setting? I mean, clearly it worked. You're a very well-educated man. You went up to Trinity. I mean, what kind of people inspired you in that setting?
I got a great education, both before, also in my primary schools, I got a great education, and which were ordinary free schools, and in Gonzaga, which had an entrance exam, and so was this selective admission. No, I got but I see it still, and when I encounter Irish people in the States, I think they still get a great education. It was I still draw on it. I mean, we had, there's a mixture of eccentrics, who wore capes and they're all still around, so I don't want to say too much about them. But I have fond memories of a lot of them. Less fond memories of some. It was my French teacher who encouraged me to do Spanish with French in college, so she played a fundamental role in my choices. But I also, you know, it's pre-internet, of course, and they had all the knowledge that we really wanted. Like, if you wanted the knowledge, you had to shake it out of them, because there was nowhere to Google it. So, I mean, that is this big fundamental difference in the relationship between students and teachers. That, you know, up until the mid to late 90s, if you wanted to know something, you had to find someone who knew it and get them to tell it to you. And so I felt, and they were also these custodians of the whole of world culture, Latin, and but I did know, I feel I got a very solid and entertaining education.
And that education continued, of course, in Trinity College Dublin, and we were speaking there about the search for identity. That's a part of our teenage years, and maybe particularly we find ourselves in these kind of quasi-privileged colleges. We're bumping up against different types of people within, nevertheless, a relatively small set. And of course, Trinity College itself is a relatively small set. And I want to actually move to your writing, the first verse published in 2008, when we met Niall Lennon, a middle-class young Dubliner, very brilliant, somewhat shy, and closeted. And he's attending Trinity College Dublin, where he's studying English. Now, you, in fact, were studying, I think, Spanish and French there. Nevertheless, some of the other parts seem to fit. So I guess I'm thinking about writing as a process of continuing self-discovery. How do you feel about that now in retrospect?
Yeah, that's a tough one. It's hard to sort it all out. But again, you know, as I said, I've been watching Almodovar, and I can see that one of the things that he does is he takes the life he might have had if things had turned out differently. Just a few things, and I think that might be a very fundamental creative impulse for people, the kind of sliding doors idea that you just, and so in that sense, Niall is definitely not me, but it is sort of some avatar of some sort of other life I might have had, or wished I might have had, or actually feared I might have had. But certainly the emotional landscape, which is what I think it's all really about, is the same. I mean, the kind of psychic landscape of that novel. In the end, it probably is really about coming out, even though that's relegated to the edges of the plot. It hardly comes into it at all. In some way, I think it is, in some very basic way, it is about that. About, like, as you said, search for identity is one way to put it. I suppose it's inserting yourself, or trying to find some matrix into which you can fit, and trying to draw some sort of coherent pattern between yourself and the rest of the world. And that's what the novel is about, that attempt.
Yeah.
And Trinity is this big Gothic presence in the background of it. I think it was more important for him than it was for me, in a way.
And just before we move on, Joyce, the one thing I do want to ask, if I can, Barry, I mean, obviously the one thing, I mean, obviously you now work in, part of your job, as it were, is in the literature department. You work in literary studies, and yet you didn't do a literature degree. You did Spanish and French. And it's something you and I were talking about with some students earlier in the week in a different setting. But I mean, that whole idea, I mean, how liberating and important was that to you as a person and intellectually, just to be able to have two functioning non-Anglophone languages, in terms of what that must, I'm always jealous, I can only speak English, I'm always jealous of people who can converse and particularly read. And the idea, I always feel if I get a novel in translation, no matter how good it is, how different is it in the original? So I mean, what do you think intellectually, that 3-4 years of just studying at the undergraduate, two different languages, their literatures and so on, how far does that broaden your repertoire, what you become capable of later on?
I mean, there were, of course, literature degrees as well, just not English literature degrees. So we were, I mean, most of the time was, or a lot of it was literature. But for me, that was my intellectual development, was learning foreign languages. That is how I came into an awareness of language, a sense of the literary world, the sense how the literary world interacts, the different channels of communication there are within it, a sense of creativity. All of that for me came from learning languages. It was my intellectual development and perfecting them. But also, I think it gives you a humility in the face of language, that you understand how much bigger language is than us, how we don't invent it. English doesn't belong to any of us. It exists, other people cooked it all up before it ever got to us. And I think that the sense of not being at home in language, which we all have, even in our mother tongue, you feel that in a very explicit way and vivid way when you're dealing with languages that aren't your own. So I think in that sense, it gave me that sensibility. I also prefer still to read fiction in languages other than English. Oddly, I find it easier to concentrate on it. Maybe it's because everything else is coming to us in English, you know, the news, the new work, everything else. Maybe that's why it feels like a rest. But I think it's also to do with those other things.
And I know your engagement with the European languages continues, actually, and the European literatures. And maybe we'll come back to that a little bit later. But right now, I want to ask you about another language, and that's about the Irish language. You didn't, I think, grow up with the Irish language, yet you did come to it. And I just wonder about that that return to the Irish language, if that's what it was. Was that merely another extension of the intellectual platforms that you had, and to give yourself another quiver in your bow? I'm using the wrong metaphor there entirely. Quiver in your bow, arrow in your, whatever. Or was it in any sense a kind of a homecoming? What brought you to that, and how did you feel about coming to the Irish language?
To just add to my Jesuit swagger, that's my mother is an Irish teacher, or she taught in all Irish schools. So we didn't speak Irish, you know, naturally at home, but it was present there. So it was always close by. What I find and still find exciting about Irish is that it's both foreign and supposedly even more native than English itself. So in some senses, it's a language that we're supposed to be closest to, but it's also very hard, and I'm not a native speaker of it, and it is in some ways it's just the hardest of them all to master. Of the languages I've studied, it's the hardest one to fully really get a handle on, I suppose, because in some ways it does come from a vanished world. There's no two ways about it. I mean, there's versions of it we can use to negotiate the modern world or deal with it, but effectively Irish is from a lost ecosystem that is very different. And so it is a lot of difference in it, I suppose. Oddly enough, it's the most, for an Irish person, it's for me a very what's the word, visceral encounter with difference, with otherness, the Irish language. You just run up in Irish, you run up against impossibilities. You know, I'm giving you an academic talk in Irish next week, only the second time I've done it. And it's really very hard to write. I find it to go around, make all of these detours to say things, or find different ways to say things. You have to find different pathways into what you're saying. You have to change what you're thinking, in fact. The thought itself has to change to come out properly in Irish.
That's really marvelous, and it's demanding a different way of thinking for you, indeed. And that presumably is some of the enrichment that comes with the use of the language, and as you say, with the actual composition of thinking through the language. And that presumably inheres in that arises from the different grammatical structures behind it, or is there, you use the word visceral there, I think there is something more visceral there, that one feels more Irish when one speaks Irish, or when one thinks through Irish. Is there anything there?
Well, I think you viscerally just feel its difference, and it's fun that I think it is. I know people, I don't want anybody to be offended when I say this, because I'm very attached to the Irish language and in favor of its promotion, but it does belong to another world in some ways, to a world we almost lost it, and we managed to hang on to it and resurrect it and rebuild it. But in its essence, it does harken back to the pre-18th century world, and it missed out on several fundamental developments that major European languages underwent. It would be a very, very different language if we had won the Battle of Kinsale, let's put it that way. It would really be a very different language. And I said, these are all things I'm saying in favor of it rather than against it, that it is a real encounter with otherness, I think, Irish.
That's a fascinating piece of whatiffery, if I may say, actually, that had we won the Battle of Kinsale, then the world would, of course, would have been a different place. But even the language itself that we would be using would be quite different. And presumably you're saying then the method of thinking. Anything more to say about that? I'm just fascinated by that.
Well, some people have mastered it, you know. So Moira Wakati writes poetry in a kind of what Irish might have looked like if it had never been interrupted. Or Brandon O'Buchla, also who founded the Irish Language Department at Notre Dame, or my colleague Jeremy Jogillon. When I hear them speak Irish, it is it's a joyful experience to hear it, because it's a mixture of a kind of high academic study and the native speaking communities of you know, West Kerry. It's a kind of confection of those two things. But that kind of Irish is very rare, and it is to some extent constructed.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you. Do you want to, well, I'm going to press on just a little bit further with that. Actually, just talk about minority language, which is something about which you've got in which you've got a particular interest indeed. And I think there's something like maybe 7,000 minority languages in the world. But I've read that maybe half of them are in danger of disappearing. And I mean, it might seem, but of course we must lament that. But why should we lament that? Is it simply the same way that we might lament the loss of a species of mammal or something like that? What are the great losses involved in the minority languages? And can you tell us anything more about the condition of minority language, apart from the Irish?
You know, as a linguist and a lover of diversity in all its forms, it makes me very sad to think of languages no longer being spoken as vernaculars. It is, I think, an inevitable process. There's you know, language. What's great about it is it really is other to us. I mean, it really is like nature or something. It isn't ours, and it jumps spontaneously out of us. And I don't know how much you can really engineer that. I do feel that there's a fundamental spirit of linguistic diversity of some kind that is irrepressible. And so even if specific languages or dialects are no longer spoken as community languages, other forms of linguistic diversity jump up to take their place. I think it is an ecosystem that just, and that could be in, you know, local turns of phrase or color of speech. I mean, I think it is, it is a very basic and irrepressible component of human life and human pleasure, linguistic diversity, and in some form it's always going to reassert itself.
I guess that has to be good news then, that we're not all heading for some grand, bland homogeneity of...
I mean, I hope. You do sometimes then click through Twitter, which I don't do often, but I do sometimes have a look, and I do worry that a certain kind of flatness, you know, people have written about this, you know, in translation studies, that a certain kind of flatness of language makes them more easily exportable. And you know, there are some studies, for example, of Italian novels now that suggest that it's becoming kind of pre-Englished, that they're sort of avoiding turns of phrase would be difficult to translate into English, and Japanese, they did in Japanese too. I mean, there is some sense that language is being flattened out. So I have that worry for literary language, but spoken language, I don't think so. I feel that people always want to entertain each other and, you know, in ways court each other socially with linguistic vitality, and that isn't something that we can lose. But it is something we should certainly cherish, you know, not take for granted. But I don't think I can see that in itself going.
Right, so that kind of Mike, sorry.
No, I was just going to remind everybody that obviously don't leave your questions till 26 minutes past the hour, because we won't have time. If you've got any questions for Barry, please do type them in. The one thing I do want to ask though, Barry, is one part of your story you talked about school and college and stuff is obviously you got to the US, to Princeton for your PhD. How was that as an experience? I mean, obviously, again, in terms of, maybe I'm putting words into your mouth there, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I mean, in that sense of learning languages from continental Europe, you're looking east, and yet you journey west to an America which, you know, has a relationship with the quote unquote old world, but is also kind of incredibly kind of aware of its own power. Is through Hollywood, etc., one of the great sort of driving forces of kind of English American as a language. So how does the young Barry McCrea arrive in Princeton and fit into that world?
I'd never been in the States before, so the first thing I saw of the States was Princeton, and then I also didn't leave for months because I was, you know, too busy. So that's for ages. That's all I saw, and so I was overwhelmed. I suppose being Irish then, and with the accent and everything, I felt special, and I cringe now and I think back how I probably played that up, and you know, probably how special I felt from being Irish. But it was fun to suddenly be Irish, you know, before everyone was Irish, and suddenly now. But I was also, I mean, a bit like Gonzaga, I was completely entranced also by this intellectual culture and the specific history of these American universities where European intellectuals had sought refuge in very dark times. You know, Thomas Mann had spent some of the war years in Princeton to get away from the Nazis. Einstein. I mean, so I was kind of in awe of it. And I was actually just thinking the other day that now I've been out of the States for longer than, it's the longest I've been out because of COVID. I haven't been out for this long in 20-something years. It is in my mind, it is in my brain in some ways. The US really entered it, that fantasies as well as realities, you know, that kind of New England of Robert Frost. But I also, the American literary use of language, I only really encountered when I went there. So Toni Morrison, for example, who does things with language I didn't think were possible. And there I understood that creativity in language isn't something that can only happen in the context of a long and many thousand-year-old literary tradition, but something that, you know, Toni Morrison is from the suburbs of Cleveland, you know, a very new place with, you know, generations that a family that only encountered English, I suppose, relatively recently, historically. And she is able to weave and hone English into something completely new. And so deeply American. I guess it was a new linguistic frontier that I remained fascinated with. But I was careful not to, as much as I could, to keep my own way of speaking and to keep, I suppose, my Dalkey accent, my precious Dalkey accent.
Your delightful Dalkey accent,
And did it make you think about, I mean, again, that kind of, the immigrant journey has been studied so often, but I mean, did it make you think about Ireland differently? Not only just your own experiences, but this small island that has such a big story within the American national narrative. As a place you'd left, would you go back? I mean, how does that relationship between you and home work?
I remember when I used to think about it, when about home, you know, about Ireland, it would seem both very, very, very small, like this tiny, tiny little speck, and also massive, like way bigger than the States. You know, I suppose it just seemed like it had layers and layers and layers because of and there is a big difference between the New World and the Old World in that the signs of the past are so, much older past are so visible to you. When you're in not in Germany, but most of Germany, for example, but there's like this exceptions. But in lots of Europe, the past is very visible to you. Whereas the States, you know, half the time nothing is older than 1970. At the same time, it manufactures its own version of oldness, and you can see that the kind of need to feel a deep history is an inescapable one. I think so. America's with great difficulty because it has a very, very difficult history to come to terms with, but it has sort of built its own. but yeah, Ireland seemed to me both enormous and tiny. And also, I left Ireland before the Celtic Tiger. We had not had really any significant immigration then. So, you know, the most exotic thing we ever saw was a Protestant. I mean, there was nothing. There was everybody was Irish, and you could know so much about people so quickly then because there were so few of us. And so in this, sorry, what I'm trying to say is that just as America kind of builds its own deep history, its own sense of deep history, all the while being a new place, in Ireland being very small and homogenous, we use kind of micro differences to sort of expand the social world, to complexify the social world for ourselves. So I guess what I learned from that was that size in terms of society and nation and culture is, it's kind of like an accordion, you know, you could just kind of, you know, expand it out.
And I'm just going to continue actually going there, as Mike's point was about America and how you felt about Ireland then. In your most recent, relatively extended stay in Ireland since the beginning of COVID, I wonder how you have felt it, what difference you've seen there since the outbreak of the pandemic. I guess you were an observer of Ireland, you were writing about the thing, and think particularly earlier on. Does it still bear close examination? Is it more pleasing to look at, or is that inspection more troubling than it was before? How do you feel about the city that you find yourself in right now, I'm asking?
Well, I think people are really nice to each other here in general. I mean, compared to other places I've lived, that just people you pass on the street and people you've encountered, they're just very kind to each other. That's, I know it's a banality, but I found that it was my big discovery, or at least confirmation during COVID. And so for that reason, it was a nice place to spend lockdown. And that there is a warmth there that I suppose had kind of seeped away during the height of the Celtic Tiger. And I'm relieved to see that it's come back. Yeah. I find the only, I suppose, criticism I have is that I find Irish introspection, cultural introspection, excessive now. And I think there's also an awful lot of focus on the present. And so they want, you know, everybody wants academics and writers and poets to opine about current affairs. And I'm not sure that's the job of poets and historians and literary professors. I think maybe the value of that is actually a bit of distance, distance and delay. You know, I think Ulysses, that's our great document for what 1904 felt like. And it was started in 1914, finished in 1922. The same about Middlemarch, written decades after it was set, but we think of it as being the document of social life in the era of, you know, the Great Reform. You know, it's you know, I'm saying something that lots of people have said before me, but that I think a bit of distance and delay is good. And I sort of, sometimes I wish kind of that Ireland would just kind of live the experience and not keep narrating it to itself.
So writers should step back and stop talking about it, at least for a while. A couple of weeks ago, we were told that historians should keep their noses out of the business and let. I wonder who is going to be commenting about what in Ireland if we take all the advice that's given to us. But I absolutely take the point. And there are a couple of questions here specifically about your writing, your own writing there, Barry. And indeed, one question has been about the effect of the Celtic Tiger and post-Celtic Tiger and how that impacted your writing. And you can maybe fold that in if you wish. You've already mentioned into another question here from Maxine, who wants you to speak about the experience of writing fiction, exploring the concept of literary creativity. Who, Maxine wonders, were your pillars, who set you on your path, what visionaries spoke to you, and from whom did you dig your knowledge from? That's a great question, a great big question.
Yeah, it is a good question. I think you know, my mind was completely set on fire by the Latin American boom writers when I was in college, the magic realism. And it just was kind of a mental explosion for me. Garcia Marquez and Cortázar and Borges that and my attempt in first it turned into something different. My initial attempt was to try and apply kind of Latin American literary modes to the Irish experience, and I suppose that's part of the other question. What is the I think my process is I don't have a process really, sorry, but I think it's all very haphazard. But when I think about what seems to me a way of proceeding is to find a literary model, perhaps not in Irish literature or literatures that are close, but from somewhere else, and to bring that into contact with Irish reality. That I suppose it's the basic biological idea that cross-pollination is a good thing. Diversity is good. And so for me to find literary models that I admire, so the Latin Americans, Proust was another enormous, I'm really not giving anybody names that they won't have come across before on these, obviously, but I don't claim to have discovered Proust either. But that these very important literary encounters I had, say with Proust or Latin American fiction, it gave me ways to make Ireland new and strange to me, because to think how would you narrate Ireland as if it were Garcia Marquez, if you're using forms of magical realism, and that's a way to make Ireland fresh and to make it kind of more vivid and visible, make its kind of its colors brighter or something. That's what I've got about it.
And does in that sense, Barry, if we think about the world of kind of Irish studies or Irish literary studies, if we take what you're saying and we should ignore the contemporary, should we then go down, is it important that we go down that line of actually going elsewhere with Ireland, putting it into a comparative context, looking transnationally, taking our inspiration from somewhere else, and actually maybe removing this habit that perhaps we've all got to a degree, that Ireland is somehow exceptional, and just calm it down by talking to others?
Yeah, completely. Would just say, I don't mean we should ignore the contemporary entirely, not at all, but I don't think we should fetishize the contemporary. And I think there's a lot, I mean, this will be music to your ears because you're a historian. There's a lot to be said about the past. And I really believe the past is not about us. The past is about them. It's about other people who are not us. And that we should march into the past and try and discover it in that spirit. But I do think that is what, if we want to find not interesting things to say about Ireland, but if we want to learn things about the world from Ireland, then that's the way to do it, to see how phenomena that are really universal manifest themselves here in particular ways. I suppose that's what Joyce is all about, isn't he, really? I mean, that's really what Ulysses is, or Dublin is.
That's the second time that you referenced Joyce, indeed. But so it's not the case, as it appeared to me just for a second or two ago, that you were constantly rejecting the precedents of great Irish writers.
Oh no, I'm a Joycean. I mean, that has been part of my job. A very dyed in the wool, and I love. I mean, I read endless Irish fiction and poetry, and I'm deeply engaged in it. I think it's also very important, both as a literary scholar and a writer, to know one's own national tradition. That I think it's a duty, really, in fact. And I think in Ireland there really is a tradition, a literary tradition that is coherent and makes sense. But to go back to Mike's earlier point, like all literary traditions, it only comes out of encounters and interactions with literary traditions elsewhere. That's how it renews itself and grows and innovates.
And just on that basis, I mean, obviously this week you're running the Notre Dame seminar for graduate students. And because of Zoom, I mean, they always come from around the world, but because of Zoom, your reach of those students is perhaps geographically far larger than it normally would be. And I talked to them earlier in the week, and It just set me thinking that kind of global spread of graduate students who are working on an interest in Ireland. In a way, if you were sitting in your office in South Bend and got an email or somebody walked into your office and said, "I want to do a PhD with you, Barry," what would excite you more? Somebody from Ireland or somebody from somewhere different with a different language, different culture, who wants to take their national or their cultural or their ethnic story and put it in an Irish context or compare it to Ireland? Which would spark your brain?
No, I think either. Both this, that what I would try and help the students to do, you know, and I have some fantastic graduate students. I've one from India now who's writing a PhD that has bits of it are Irish, bits of it are from other places, but that they would, for their own sake and their own entertainment and pleasure as well as everything else, I would want either of those students to have some encounter with the self in their work and some encounter with the other. So in some sense, what you write has to be some form of weird undercover autobiography. And in some sense, it has to be a complete unvarnished encounter with something alien and other. So you need, I think, for good scholarship, good fiction, in fact, good PhD, you need to have both of those things, an encounter with the self and an encounter with the other. You just have to, you know, for an Irish person writing about Irish things, you have to produce those results, you know, in different ways. You just need to mix the chemicals differently than you would for somebody coming from Australia or something.
And I just want to, before you go, Joe, I do want to reaffirm something you say there, Barry, that always strikes me when you've got a student or you've got people within the job we do. We're all supposed to be enjoying this. It's supposed to be pleasurable because we've made an active choice to do it. We're not doing penal servitude. It's not miserable. And I think that kind of joyous, pleasurable approach to what we do is one of the key driving things. Anyway, Joe.
Yeah, well, no, the question I was going to ask was going to put aside just to say how much I agree with that, and to say that we began with the question actually that turned down to the question of pleasure, and the pleasure of literature, and the pleasure of writing, and the duty, if there is an absolute obligation on the part of the business that we're in, to open up to our students the pleasure of literature, analysis of pleasure, but pleasure, I think, perhaps above all. And I just want to continue there where we were, and Mike's question about your own dealings with your students and who you would prefer to come in. Can I ask the rather more broad question about what we're supposedly speaking about this evening, and that indeed is the future of Irish studies? Are the glory days over? I mean, where do you see it's going? What are its strengths? What are its weaknesses? I mean, what right now were you given some sort of powers? What would be called upon? What needs to be brought into the thing? What can re-energize it? How can it increase?
Well, first, I think you'd be one of the first people I'd ring if I was given those powers to ask for advice. So, but now, Irish studies, as we know it now, I mean, the field that we are now was invented, to use, you know, the title of Declan Kybert's, you know, seminal book. It was invented in the 80s and 90s, and by a distinct group that had a set of complex relationships amongst themselves, and like all great cultural and scholarly innovations. And we wouldn't be here. We wouldn't have Irish studies without that. Sure. Obviously, it was of its time. Everything is of its time, and you know, their work is in many ways, I think, eternal. I don't think, it's not that I think it goes out of date, but how we conceive of the field obviously has to be different. I think, I'm going to repeat myself, it's not by running after news cycle issues that are in the contemporary news cycle. I fear that makes us less relevant rather than more. But I think, for example, historiography has had undergone enormous changes in recent years. So whole new approaches to history are really possible. I mean, the reevaluation of 16th and 17th century Ireland is that's something that there's an enormous amount of interesting work that could be done, both in literature and in history, and people are doing it. I'm not saying they're not, but I think there are huge, and the 19th century, which has recently been a field of great interest for people, there really is a lot of new stuff waiting for us in the past, and that's what I would embrace, I think. And I would, as a third and last time I'll say it, I would de-emphasize the contemporary.
Okay, okay. So what is old can be made new again if we are fresh enough in our thinking, as it says. And the question that's relevant here coming from Kate Costello-Sullivan, lovely to hear you. And she's struck, of course, as I think we all were, by your comment about how one brings oneself in writing, how one brings oneself into writing. It reminds her of Tobin's, and she's not able to embed father, so it's Toybin. Tobin, wonderful, wonderful Kate, comment that we are always writing from a deep sense of self. How do the critical and the creative overlap in this regard, Kate wonders, because she says we tend to think the critical as more sterile, but in fact, it isn't. Thoughts on that? Thank you, Kate.
I mean, it's such a fundamental point. We could learn a lot from those people I mentioned earlier, in fact, who founded Irish Studies in their work and the ways in which they plumbed their own past and their own particular circumstances, and combined it with readings in, say, the 18th century, or in Heaney's case, classical literature, to forge something that is a mixture of self and other. But I'm not an autobiographical writer, despite our earlier exchange, Joe. For me, writing is about imagination, and my way of understanding society and the world is to invent a new one in my head. That's obviously not something you can do with scholarship in the same way, or you become like, what's his name in the Nabokov novel, Kinbote from Pale Fire. You just start inventing things. On the other hand, an awareness of why something has attracted your interest and why it's giving you pleasure, I think, is a great place to start, and in literary studies and literary encounter. And you're right to emphasize again pleasure, because I think it's a complex form of pleasure, and it's that form of pleasure, I suppose, reaches its most fully articulated expression in literary criticism. That's it's a pleasure we get viscerally, just a feeling when we read, but then in a way it's most refined. I don't mean that in a snobby way, but I just mean it's most kind of elaborated or worked on. Version comes in literary criticism, but it does start with something very intimate, criticism and interpretation, and I do think it is a very creative act, that just as creative as writing a memoir or poetry. I've been writing mostly fiction for the last several years in this long novel I've been writing that is partly about the Celtic tiger, but I have the same feeling of creativity, when I read good literary criticism, or good history for that matter.
And
another question from Seamus. Could you speak to the inspiration for the sortes in the first verse? And do you want to publish more fiction in the future?
He does. No.
Well, definitely I do, because I've been working on this novel for 7 years. So if it's not published, I'll be, I'm furious. But anyway, I'm still working on it. So, it was about the sortes, wasn't it? That was a game that people played when I was in college, that you would ask, it's a form of psychoanalysis light, I suppose, where a group of friends get together, ask a question about one of the friends, the friend picks a random line from a book as the answer, and then we all used to discuss why the answer was correct. So it was a form, what could go wrong, as they say. And I suppose in a gay way, it's an extreme version of close reading, that you just decide that whatever text is in front of you has all of the answers. So you have to exercise all of your powers of interpretation, translation, and close reading to squeeze every possible last drop of meaning out of the text. But it is also about the ways in which we distort meaning if we're too narcissistic in our approach to reading. That if we think everything is about ourselves, we're going to misread. Sometimes it's not about you, in other words. Yeah.
That's lovely, lovely, lovely. And I see a question from Ida here too. I'm really enjoying the series of Generation X interviews. Of course, your Gen X interviews that you've been doing yourself, Barry. What has Barry learned about the Irish Gen X generally from those interviews? And what distinguishes them from us, whoever we are, the old fogies who are listening in here tonight, I suppose? What distinguishes them from us, from Generation X's? And indeed, further continuation needed, thank you. And indeed from Generation X in other parts of the Western world.
Well, the second part, one thing that makes us very different from American Gen X is that there's loads of us in Ireland. You know, we were a baby boom, the children born in the 70s. Whereas in the US, they're very small. Yeah, they came from much smaller families than their parents did. So, you know, when I was growing up, children were 10 a penny. I mean, there was nothing very special about being a child. There was like everywhere you looked, there was 5 more children hanging out the window. There was nobody was, you know, so we definitely weren't given put it mildly, not given a sense that we were special. And I do pick that up from them, actually, from the Irish Gen X writers. But also that there's sly ways of gaining attention. Humor is one of them, you know, what in Latin is called captatio benevolentia, where you try to capture the goodwill of the audience with a joke. I see that in Paul Murray, for example, in his style, you know. And I feel that does come from this highly overpopulated and under-resourced Ireland of the 70s and 80s, where, you know, you had to some sort of party piece or joke or whatever you could throw at it to get somebody to pay a bit of attention. But I found them also very modest and self-effacing, but it might have been because I chose such good writers, you know.
Wonderful, marvelous, marvelous. And there are a few more questions, but I don't think we're going to get to them, actually, indeed. I'm afraid we have to end there. And before we actually say goodbye to you, Barry, I'm going to turn to Mike there for a second. And Mike, can you tell us who we're going to have in 2 weeks' time? 2 weeks.
Well, indeed, Joe. In 2 weeks' time. So we're talking Friday, the 25th of June, same time as always, 9:30 in Ireland, 4:30 p.m. East Coast of the States. We're going to have Nessa Cronin, no relation, from NUIG, who has been doing tremendous work both in the Irish language and in English, but really kind of trying to push Irish studies to look at and understand big questions about the environment, about the global future, about landscape. And she comes to that in one way because she's actually the person who's kind of in charge or overseeing the Tim Robinson archive that he gifted to NUIG. So really kind of interesting views of environment and landscape, not just from an Irish and West of Ireland perspective, but also from a global one. So that is in 2 weeks' time, Friday, 25th of June. As always, you can watch it here on the webinar by going to Eventbrite and typing in Boston College Irish Influence. And if you want to watch Barry again or any of the other talks from the last few months, go to YouTube and type in Irish Influence and you'll find them all there.
That was marvelous. Thank you very, very much, Mike. Thank you so much, Barry.
Thank you. It was a real pleasure.
Absolute pleasure in this part. And thank you, everybody. And see you all in a fortnight, as we say in Ireland, in 2 weeks, as the Americans like to call it. Thank you very much, everybody. I'm going to ask you to leave there now. Bye-bye. Thanks again. Take care. Bye-bye, Seamus and Maxine, Kathleen. Thanks again, Ada and H. And another compliment there, not surprising, Gregory, from Gregory, who says, well, a pleasant lack of literary pomposity, he says. And that's a reference to you, Barry, and that's absolutely true, indeed. That was really